Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. Chapter 2 continues Paul's discussion of God's wisdom rather than worldly wisdom. He's calling them to look to the Spirit of God, not the words of man. In the ancient world of Greece and Corinth, there were people called rhetoricians who would speak publicly intending to impress other people with their wisdom. They would try and persuade people to believe a certain point, whether or not they even believed it themselves. And Paul shows them that as believers, they are not like this. Their focus is instead on the cross of Jesus. Faith doesn't come from intellect or persuasion. It comes from the Holy Spirit working through the gospel being proclaimed. Paul reminds them of how, when he was first with them, he wasn't trying to convince them with fancy words or eloquent speech. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself, unlike the rhetoricians of the day. And actually, he didn't draw attention to himself as a knowledgeable person in any way. He only wanted to highlight Jesus and the cross. He didn't come as a strong and impressive and charismatic person. He came in simplicity and humility. The gospel doesn't need to be preached in a performative or softened way for people to be able to receive it. We don't need to hide the parts like taking up your cross and denying yourself. We don't need to try and defend God or make him look better. We should try to present it faithfully and in obedience to how the Holy Spirit is leading us. We should be culturally sensitive in the way we communicate it. But we also have to present it in a way that glorifies and focuses on Jesus, not on ourselves. We are not persuading, we are heralding. People should leave the sermons we preach or the evangelism we do marveling at Jesus, not at our way with words or wise points. We want people to have faith in him, not us. Once someone is mature in faith, it's appropriate for them to receive deeper wisdom of God. The wisdom of God that is secret and hidden seems to refer to the gospel, God's plan of salvation that has been in the works for all time. This wisdom is only accessible by revelation from God. That doesn't mean that there's no point in preaching the gospel, though. People must hear the good news in order to be able to respond to it. But God is the one at work within people's hearts, allowing it to be received. Paul makes the contrast between the wisdom of God and the wisdom of the rulers of the world, whom people interpret either as the political and religious rulers or spiritual powers. God's wisdom is Jesus going to the cross. That doesn't make sense to us. That doesn't seem like wisdom. But in his wisdom, it was part of God's plan for allowing people to be counted as righteous. If the rulers of the age had known that they were fulfilling a step in God's plan, they wouldn't have crucified Jesus. But that's the point. Human wisdom is so far below God's wisdom. That's why we can be encouraged and have hope at every point in our lives. No matter the circumstances, we can trust in God's wisdom, even if we don't get the answers in this life. We can trust that he's looking at the bigger picture, and that he's working all things for the good of those who love him. Paul goes on to paraphrase from Isaiah, and it's a verse you've probably heard before. What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. Often people use this verse to talk about heaven. We can look forward to glory and joy in heaven, and that's true, but Paul's also talking about our life now. The gospel is good news for us today as well, not just in the future. And he also goes on to say that nobody can understand the thoughts of God except for the Spirit of God. Nobody can understand the wisdom of God, which is the gospel, without the Holy Spirit. But guess what? We've received the Holy Spirit who dwells within us. And so the Holy Spirit plays a critical role in both communicating and receiving the gospel of salvation. People share about Jesus through his words, not their own. and then the listener receives the Holy Spirit by his wisdom, not their own intellect. Paul is really emphasizing at the end of chapter 2 that people cannot come to Jesus or salvation by their own thoughts or wisdom. Naturally, unbelievers will hear the gospel and they will think that it is rubbish and foolishness. It is only by the revelation of the Holy Spirit that people receive the gospel and are saved. It is only those who are called by God that will have the gospel revealed to them. This is God's mercy on display, that he would choose some to be with him, though none deserve it. This is something we'll talk more about in Romans. But when we talk about God choosing people, we often then think that God therefore condemns people to hell. But we have to remember that what condemns people is their sin, which all people have committed. So it is actually wonderful grace and mercy that God would even invite anyone to come and be with him. Paul emphasizes again in the final couple of verses of chapter 2 this contrast between believers and unbelievers. The spiritual, those who have the Holy Spirit, are able to understand the wisdom of God to a much greater degree than unbelievers can. We have received the mind of Christ. That means that we can understand God's plan for salvation. And it also means that we can adopt the perspectives and attitudes that Jesus has, rather than our worldly ones. As we grow in maturity as believers, this is something that comes more naturally. We practice choosing to see things how Jesus sees them. We don't get stuck in negativity and pessimism, but choose to see opportunities for the gospel and for joy. So let's zoom out for a second to look at where this discussion on wisdom fits within the context of Paul's letter. Remember that they're choosing people to follow based on their idea of what is wise or who speaks most eloquently. They're also being prideful about spiritual gifts and who has the quote-unquote best ones. Paul is calling them to see the foolishness of this. They have no wisdom without the Holy Spirit's revelation. It was never by their intellect that they were saved, and so they shouldn't be divided over preachers or gifts or wisdom or whatever, because Jesus is calling them into one body who shares the mind of Christ. They are called to be different from the world, and instead walk in humility and unity under Christ. How does this equip us? So with all of this talk about how we communicate and receive the gospel, how should we actually go about this? How do we do evangelism or run conferences or minister to big crowds of people? First, we remember that it's not our responsibility to convert people, because we actually can't. That's the Holy Spirit's job. Often when we go to youth rallies or big conferences, it can feel like they are trying to manipulate people into feeling a man-made Holy Spirit through the lighting or the music choices or their tone of voice. I'm not saying that this is always disingenuous, but we can't manipulate people into feeling God's presence. We have to seek his guidance, especially with things like running these big events, and be obedient to him. Secondly, we have to remember that we're heralds, not rhetoricians like the ancient Greeks. Our job is to proclaim the good news, not make it sound better or easier than it actually is. That's why we can often hear stories of people who were given a Bible, they read it, and by revelation from the Holy Spirit they were saved. Sometimes people shy away from the thought of giving someone a Bible, because there's difficult stuff in there. But we have to remember that God is the one who grows faith in people. And thirdly, even though it is by revelation from God that people are saved, that doesn't mean that evangelism is pointless. God works through our proclamation of the gospel to save those who are called. And we don't know who the called ones are. So we have to be faithful to preach the gospel to all those we can, knowing that God will be faithful to redeem the lost. So ultimately, as we go about our lives, let's be people who herald the good news of the gospel, even when people think we're foolish, knowing that God's Spirit is alive and active in people's hearts.